As far as mythological figures go, the boogeyman is one of the stranger ones, considering how little set details such a famous idea has. The term might have its roots in the 1500s, could have its name derived from hobgoblins, and has different incarnations in different parts of the world, the Russian Baba Yaga being the most famous. Boogeyman is also a term you'll be pretty sick of by the time you reach the end of John Carpenter's Halloween. The movie's iconic slasher Michael Myers is called the Boogeyman frequently, described as pure evil and not a man at all. On paper, however, when you really think about it, Michael Myers is nothing but an escaped serial killer, something that the film-going American public would have been all too familiar with by 1978. The 1970s was pretty much the decade of serial murder in the States, with numerous infamous offenders popping up before the release of Halloween. Now, it's on record that John Carpenter and Deborah Hill didn't base Michael Myers off of any real-life criminal, but being the true crime nerd that I am, it's interesting to me how generally accurate a depiction of a serial killer Michael Myers actually is. Referring to research and writing from close enough to the time, just how accurate is Michael Myers to the real-life boogeyman of the era? The work we'll be referencing here today will be Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives by Robert Ressler, John Douglas, and Ann Burgess. The findings and data for the book were collected between 1979 and 1983, where agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Science Unit interviewed 36 incarcerated murderers. If you've seen the Netflix show Mindhunter, it dramatizes the events of the process. They used the results of these interviews and the data collected to draw up personality profiles of serial offenders and what makes them tick. Now, it's not the end-all to be-all for this sort of research. In fact, a lot of aspects of it are somewhat outdated or questionable now, but the foundation remains solid, and this is the most complete analysis of serial killers, which would have been relevant somewhat close to the film's release. With the preamble out of the way, here's the question today. Well, what kind of serial killer is Michael Myers? First things first, though, how did the book divide serial killers, in broad terms? 3 categories are used to split them up: organized offenders, disorganized offenders, and mixed offenders. The organized offender, as described in the book, is one who plans his murder in a conscious manner and who displays control over his victim at the crime scene. Generally speaking, organized killers come from stable households, at least in financial terms. They also possess an average to above average IQ. Organized killers are usually socially adept to some degree and may be married or living with a partner during their crime spree. Organized killers are more mobile than their disorganized counterparts, and will usually kill further from their homes by using a car in the commission of their crimes. They tend to keep trophies from their victims, as well as following the media written about their crimes. Organized offenders are also extremely detail-oriented. Control of the situation before, during, and after is a must for these kind of people, as these killers try to cover their tracks to avoid detection. They also have a certain victim type. The victim is usually a complete stranger, and usually the organized offender will stalk them beforehand. When confronting the victim, the organized offender will generally attempt to disarm the victim through the use of a weapon for coercion, or by simply talking to them and acting friendly. Think of Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, and you kinda see what I mean. So how does Myers compare to this generalized profile? For starters, well, we know basically nothing about his childhood and family circumstances beyond him having a mother and father, and, him having a sister before, we can gather that his home life at the very least was financially stable. After all, his home is a quiet middle-class suburb in a seemingly good neighborhood with both parents still in his life. While it is a stolen car and more of an opportunistic acquisition, Myers does use a vehicle in commission of his crimes to add some mobility. This mobility helps him check another criteria box for the organized offender, stalking his selected victims who he picks seemingly at random and fit into a type. Basically, Myers' type is his sister and anyone who is like her, which, unfortunately for them, is Laurie Strode and all her friends. And one more thing, but Myers takes his sweet time throughout the film setting up and staging his entire crime scene for Laurie, his true mark, to come stumble upon. However, the match isn't exact. Unlike the profile of most organized offenders, Myers famously has zero social skills. At all. To the point where Dr. Loomis even says he hasn't spoken a word in the 15 years he was incarcerated. Even if he did speak in normal circumstances, Myers makes no attempt to communicate with his victims, which is a trademark of the organized offender. And while you could argue he's controlling the crime scene to set up the display he does at the end, Myers isn't making any attempt to conceal his crimes or escape undetected. Really, this is the key feature of an organized offender: attempts to mask their actions and return to their everyday life. A lot of the defining characteristics of organized killers can be boiled down to this double life they lead, something Myers makes absolutely zero attempt to do. So what about the disorganized offender? Once again referring to sexual homicide, the disorganized offender is less consciously aware of a plan, and his crime scenes usually display haphazard behavior. Disorganized offenders usually possess below average intelligence and come from abusive or other kinds of unstable households. The disorganized offender is generally socially inadequate with a habit of poor impulse control. The disorganized offender, for one reason or another, tends to kill within their immediate geographic area. And rather than carefully controlling the situation to subdue their chosen victim, the disorganized offender prefers to quickly rush down their target with a blitz-style assault, killing them shortly after meeting. The disorganized offender may also wear a mask while committing their crime. While possessing less control over the crime scene when compared to the organized offender profile, the disorganized offender may still have a desire to stage the scene of the crime. They tend to do this after the murder itself, however, and the staging of the victim's body usually is less of a case of attempted disposal and more of a ritualistic, symbolic setup, which means something to the killer themselves. Myers lines up with the disorganized offender profile in a few ways. A bit of a technicality, but while Myers did have to travel a fair distance to get to the town of Haddonfield, Illinois, keep in mind that Haddonfield is his home. The only home he ever had, and while he does kill a truck driver on the way to town, it was more out of convenience, and Haddonfield was always his intended haunting grounds. In a sense, he was killing within his immediate geographic area then. What isn't a technicality is how Myers almost always wears a mask in commission of his crimes when given the choice. He puts one on before killing his sister in the flashback, and shoplifts one before committing his spree in the present. Myers is also obviously socially inadequate for the reasons we already went over, as well as little things, such as how he kills a dog and eats it seemingly raw when he got hungry. While Myers does show a good deal of planning and prep for his crimes, the only victim he seems to really put work into is Lori herself. Her friends he kills with much less flair, and one of the boyfriends, who falls out of his preferred victim type, he kills with the disorganized offender's preferred method of a blitz. Stacking all of that together, I'd say it's a fair assessment that Myers can be classified as a disorganized killer primarily. While some details show a degree of intense pre-planning more in line with the organized profile, the majority of examples lean in closer to the latter option. Outside of the organized-disorganized dichotomy, serial killers tend to have a few other elements in common. For one thing, animal cruelty is an often reoccurring element in the upbringing and lives of serial killers. The act of killing itself proving to be a method of making death a normal aspect of the offender's life. To quote, "What might appear to us to be an abrupt change of character and suddenly killing a cat or a person proves to be based on much more conscious and preconscious activity as well as on prior preparatory acts. This process reinforces the centrality of violence and murder in the lives of these men. Violence and killing are now natural and justified acts in their lives." As previously mentioned, adult Myers kills dogs twice throughout the film, and his nonchalance about doing so implies a level of banality the act now has to him. Another extremely common aspect among serial killers is a rich, detailed fantasy world killers create and explore throughout their lives. Fantasies that eventually inform the crimes they go on to commit. Our study suggests that instead of developing peer-related interests and activities, the murderers' adolescents retreated into their own sexually violent fantasy worlds. Basically, think of it as maladaptive daydreaming from hell. It also might be the most common recurring element between serial killers, given how frequently this trait appears. The 36 sexual murderers in our study, replying to the fundamental question of what triggered their first murders, revealed that, as a group, they were 1. Aware of their long-standing preoccupation and preference for a very active fantasy life, and 2. Devoted to violent, sexualized thoughts and fantasies. Most of these fantasies, prior to the first murder, focused on killing. This contrasts with the fantasies that evolved after the first murder. These advanced levels of fantasies often focused on perfecting various phases of the murder. In essence, the escalating nature of serial killings comes from this obsessive focus on fantasy, with the killer having a broad crime in mind before fleshing out the particular details in gruesome ways as they continue to kill. Of all of the elements of serial killer psychology discussed here today, this is the detail which fits Michael Myers to an absolute T. Going back to the beginning, in the 1963 flashback segment of the film, we see Michael's first murder of his sister Judith. This scene sets up Myers' MO down to the letter. He begins outside the house, stalking his target from afar and waiting until they're in a vulnerable position. He creeps inside, donning a mask and getting a knife for the crime itself, scares his victim in some way, then finally finishes it. While absolutely an inference on my part, it's not too much of a stretch to see this as Michael's fantasy crime. It's a scaled back version of what we see him do in the 1978 present of the film. Dr. Loomis himself even alludes to this fantasy world and daydreaming aspect when he discusses how Michael would just stare blankly at a wall from the time he was incarcerated. Apprehension does not end the fantasy of murder. The level of excitement may drop, the physical stimulation may subside, yet the fantasy continues. The murderer relives one murder and plans another. In my opinion, the core motivation in Michael Myers' drive to kill is an attempt to recreate the night he killed his sister. The true targets of his aggression are all extremely similar to Judith physically, with the boyfriend and truck driver he kills in the meantime dying with the least amount of effort on Michael's part. The film even draws this parallel itself, with Myers posing a victim's body underneath the stolen headstone of Judith Myers. Each kill on this night is just an attempt to symbolically recreate the murder of his sister, with the details getting more elaborate to match the fantasy he built in those 15 years staring at a wall, picturing them. This has gone on long enough, and I think y'all get the picture. I just find it interesting how, for a movie that doesn't really try to emulate any real murderers, Halloween managed to depict a fairly believable serial killer with Michael Myers, and how well he matches up with the criminal profiling into offenders near the time of the film's release. Trying to analyze Myers through a purely psychological lens, though, is somewhat missing the fun of the movie. After all, as the good doctor says,
this isn't a man.
From the impossible feat of strength he shows against the boyfriend, to his ghost-like presence constantly trailing Laurie Strode like the Grim Reaper on her doorstep, and how he refuses to ever just stay dead, Myers blurs the line of being a man in a mask and being something else entirely. Paired with the ramblings of Loomis acting like the Van Helsing to his Count Dracula, and Michael Myers becomes the bridge between the monsters of myth and the worst kind of men in reality. The iconic ending of him disappearing off in the night reinforcing the idea that something like Myers could always be out there, watching and waiting.